Welcome once again into the Radiopedia Reading Room, a podcast unconcerned with books or poetry, tea leaves or palmistry. This is a radiology podcast. My name is Andrew Dixon, and joining me, he's an expert at turning up for podcast recordings. He's done it 49 times in a row now. It's my co-host, Frank Gaylard.
Oh, they say half the battle is turning up, Dixon. But for me, I have to say the other half is trying to convince myself that I don't need a mixed drink at 10 a.m. just to get through another podcast with you. 49 already?
It is.
That's crazy.
It's 49. So the 50th episode coming up soon. Didn't you agree a while back to do a special reading from your Harry Potter knockoff novel that you wrote years ago in the 50th episode? I have vague memories of you agreeing to that.
No, definitely not. I said 50 episodes was too soon. We'll do it at 100 episodes or 150 or 200.
Oh, no. Perhaps we should switch to daily episodes to make it happen quicker. How about just a taste of the opening paragraph in the 50th episode, perhaps? It was the best of magic. It was the worst of magic.
I am deeply regretting ever owning up to having done this. From memory, the main character is called David. And he
was the best of David. He was the worst of David.
And he finds out that he can create portals into an alternative world, a world full of magic and peril. Along the way, he rescues his father, learns the meaning of friendship, and just maybe becomes the world's greatest wizard. Is that what you want?
No, I actually want you to read the prose. I want to be immersed in the world of Gaylard make-believe. I want to feel young again. Now, before we get to today's episode, Gaylard, two quick things. Firstly, I need to apologise to a listener named Tarig who emailed us back in October and I missed it. And so he reached out to us again this week. So, Tarig, next episode, we're going to cover what you emailed us about, I think. Frank will make it his number one priority. So stay rad, and I'm sorry that I missed your message.
Sure. Priority number one. Got it. I have literally no idea what you're talking about, but I'm sure it's going to be excellent.
Yep, it's going to be perfect. And the other thing before I introduce the main segment today, Gaylard, it is June. And so that means an obligatory shout out for the Radiopedia 2024 virtual conference because it's fast approaching. It's happening July 22 to 26. We're in the thick of organising the event at the moment, editing lectures, writing MCQs, recording panel discussions and case workshops, and everything is looking absolutely amazing. So if you haven't registered yet, then please do. You can get conference-only access, or you can register with the Radiopedia All Access Pass, which comes with very generous on-demand access periods, so you'll be able to catch up on everything, and you can claim your maximum of 62 AMA PRA Category 1 credits TM in italics. And if you've already registered, then thank you very much. You're awesome. And don't forget to help spread the word with your colleagues because we really do want to keep the conference momentum powering forward for years and years to come. Right, Frank?
Absolutely. It's not just that the conference is fantastic as a standalone event, but it's increasingly becoming an integrated part of the whole Radiopedia community. We use it as a way of targeting review of content, of creating new articles, new questions, illustrations, uploading new cases. And also we shamelessly plunder it for this podcast. So,
and for the main segment today, our plundering and pillaging goes all the way back to Radiopedia 2022 and a lecture that friend of the podcast, Jeremy Jones, recorded entitled Being an Expert Witness. So Jeremy is a paediatric radiologist in Edinburgh, and he has extensive experience as a radiology expert witness in cases of non-accidental injury. So this was actually a visual lecture, but I think it works really well in audio medium, except for a section in the middle where Jeremy shows how he goes about writing his reports. So when we get to that bit, Gaylard, we're going to come back in and do a little midtro, and I'll explain Jeremy's process, and then we'll listen to the rest of the lecture. Anyway, it'll all make sense when we get to it, Gaylard. You just strap yourself in. And
I will. I'm strapped.
So even though this is about being an expert witness, I think there are a lot of tips in here that also apply to other situations where you might find yourself in court, not necessarily as the expert. And before we listen in, there is discussion of child abuse in this episode, which may be a trigger for some listeners, and so listener discretion is advised here. So I'll go ahead and hit play, and then Frank and I will be back soon for a midtro, and then again for a chat in the outro. Hey,
Hi, I'm Jeremy Jones and I'm a paediatric radiologist from Edinburgh in Scotland. I'm an expert witness and have been involved in writing several hundred expert reports, giving evidence in court, mainly in child protection cases. This talk is about being an expert, writing reports and giving evidence. The report writing and evidence giving parts will be relevant for reporters who aren't experts too, so there's something here for everyone. I'd like to start with a story. A couple of years ago, I received an email from one of our regional prosecutors. In Scotland, these are called procurators fiscal. You might know them as Crown prosecutors, state prosecutors, or district attorneys, depending on where you're from. The email asked whether I could give an opinion on a child abuse case. I said yes, produced a report, and gave evidence in the subsequent trial. There were multiple long bone fractures, rib fractures, a skull fracture, and intracranial injuries. The man was tried, convicted, and sentenced. The judge remarked on the horror and wickedness of what he'd done to the baby, and the media reported the case with horror. That triggers a question. Why would I consider getting involved in being an expert witness if this is the type of case I'm going to have to review? Well, as a paediatric radiologist, this is part of my day-to-day work. I already report many cases of suspected child abuse. I'm part of a regional MDT. I've discussed many cases with child protection and forensic medics over the years, as well as reading and studying the literature around the subject. Given all of that, how can I not? Some may still ask, why would I willingly spend my free time reviewing cases of suspected abuse? Why would I choose to look at images of babies with broken arms or legs or ribs? Well, these are the types of cases where the evidence of an expert can ensure justice is delivered, the perpetrators are appropriately punished, and children are protected. What's happened to the child has already happened. I can't change that. But I might be able to help ensure that the person who did it doesn't do it again, and that the child and their siblings end up in a place of safety. Saying all that, most experts don't do child protection work. Most expert opinion relates to medical negligence cases. In these cases, your evidence and opinion can ensure that a patient who didn't receive the appropriate care receives compensation, or that a colleague is supported if their practice was appropriate. So, what is the role of an expert? My role is to take what can be sometimes complex imaging findings and present an opinion about the injuries that are present, their timing and mechanism. Most important is that I do that in a way that's balanced, digestible, and understandable by prosecution and defence, judge and jury. After that previous case, I got an email from the prosecuting barrister. She said that she was extremely grateful for my involvement and that my report and evidence have been very clear and helpful. I think that the evidence I gave made a difference. It helped the jury make their decision, and it helped ensure that the accused was found guilty and sent to jail. Broadly speaking, law cases are either criminal or civil. Criminal law seeks to punish for an offence. Civil law seeks to achieve a remedy, and that's usually through compensation. Family law is a subset of civil law, and in some places there are special children's courts for matters relating to minors. Any of us could be called to give a statement or report in any of these types of cases. If that happens, you're being called as what's called a professional witness or witness to fact. As a professional witness, you might be asked, how were you involved in the case? What imaging was performed? How did you interact with the patient? What imaging did you report? What did you see? What did you think? And how did you write your original radiology report? You might also be asked whether you would still write the same report, given additional information or subsequent findings. This is different from an expert. An expert is there to give an opinion, and that's usually after reviewing a large volume of additional information. These can include medical records, witness statements, police records, and other expert reports, as well as supporting documents that have been generated as part of the prosecution. What makes an expert an expert? A radiology expert witness is somebody who has a significant amount of experience in a particular field of radiology. Remember, it's their job to review imaging and weigh the findings with the rest of the evidence and respond to a set of instructions that they'll have been given. Do you have to be a radiologist with 20 years experience in a niche subspecialty area? The simple answer is no. An expert likely reports studies in a specialty area as part of their job. They're an experienced and trusted member of their local team, and they're probably the person in the department who people ask questions of and go to for opinions. They may be involved regionally or nationally in service delivery or guideline creation, and they may publish in their area of expertise as well. But that's not always the case. So let's assume that you're that experienced person. What else do you need to be an expert? You need to be methodical and critical in the way that you approach a topic, and you need to be able to formulate those thoughts in a sensible way that other people can understand. You're going to need to take your thoughts about a case and create a report. This will include your opinion about the radiology and how it relates to the case. The report will have to carry the weight of an expert, but also be understandable by police officers and solicitors, and potentially a judge who may not have had any experience in that area of medicine. As an expert, you also need to be confident and calm under pressure, and sensible enough to know when your expertise ends and when to say so. If you're going to be an expert, it's more than likely that you'll end up on the witness stand. And if you do, then it's more than likely you'll end up being asked questions by a defence barrister. And when that happens, it's more than likely that they'll know exactly what questions to ask to unpick any uncertainty that you might have. When I was first asked to write a report for the defence in a child protection case, I struggled to know whether to accept or not. In the end, I did, and the reason I did was based on the fact that my report should be the same independent on who is asking me for it. Plus, the accused might not be guilty. To highlight why taking on an instruction from the defence is the right thing to do, I'm going to share another case with you. There are a small number of cases in the UK that have changed the way child protection is practiced. These include Victoria Climby in 2000 and baby Peter Connolly in 2007. The case of Arthur Levinjo Hughes in 2021 will be added to that list. And if you're feeling particularly strong, you can read the details of that case. It was reported widely at the end of last year. I was asked to review the imaging for the defence and to answer a standard set of questions about timing and mechanism, as well as whether I agreed with the prosecution expert's report. I reviewed the imaging, read through the 1,000-page court bundle, and considered the expert reports. I agreed with the prosecution's expert, and I said so. That was where my involvement ended. I didn't play any part in the court case, and I wasn't called to give evidence. What this pair have been convicted of is horrific and evil, and they will spend a very long time in prison for the murder of this little lad. Offering an opinion to the defence that ensures confidence in the prosecution expert witness report was entirely the right thing to do. I only tell you this story in the hope that it helps anyone else who is struggling with the decision about whether to accept instructions from the defence. Keep an open mind, approach the case critically and fairly, and write the report you would have written independent of who has asked for your opinion. Okay, we are going to write a report. You've reported some imaging as part of your day-to-day work. There's a humerus x-ray and a skeletal survey. The police are involved and they've asked you to provide a statement.
Okay, and this is where we cut back in, Gaylard.
Okay.
Hopefully everybody is enjoying what they've heard so far. So at this point in the lecture, Jeremy shows off really his PHP web app coding skills as he generates an expert radiology report on the fly. In a typical Jones fashion, he has it all set up to auto-generate and lay out beautifully. And so if you're an all-access pass holder and are interested in looking at that, then definitely go across to the website and you'll find his lecture in our miscellaneous lecture collection. But otherwise, I'm going to quickly explain how he constructs his expert reports. So he has, I think, 7 or so sections. The first section is the introduction, and most of these sections are actually quite standardized that he uses over and over again for his reports. So the introduction really explains who he is and what his credentials are. The second section is the materials, where he lists out everything that basically he's been given upon which to base his report. So the images, documents, summary of events that he's received from the police, etc. Then the next section he has is general information. So this is really important. This is a section written for the layperson that outlines generic facts about, the disease or the injury that's at the core of the case, how it is imaged, that kind of stuff. And this is background information that he thinks the judge, lawyer, jury may need to understand his opinion, which is what comes later. So, for example, in Jeremy's case, he has a section on imaging of non-accidental injury, one for skeletal imaging, one for neuroimaging, one that's titled What are X-rays, and one that is What is a CT scan. And these are really basic descriptions of what these processes are, but it kind of means that everybody's on the same page. The next section is the imaging findings. So this is where he goes through the specific imaging modalities and the findings in the case, and again explains it in lay terms. So instead of just, X-ray shows a spiral fracture of the right humeral midshaft, he gives an explanation of the entire image in a series of easy to understand statements. So he'll say, there is a spiral fracture of the midshaft of the right humerus with associated displacement and soft tissue swelling. He includes a picture of it with a really clearly defined label pointing out at the fracture, not just assuming that the jury knows what a fracture looks like. Then he has a statement like, this is an X-ray of the right humerus taken from the front. The humerus is the large bone of the upper arm. In this image, the shoulder is at the top, the elbow is at the bottom. So he's really clearly setting the scene of what that image contains. The fracture is marked by the arrow, and the dark area between the edges of the bone represents the fracture displacement. And then he says, a spiral fracture is a complete fracture, a break that has extended all the way across the bone. It looks similar to a corkscrew where the fracture line spirals through the bone. So he's kind of detechnicalized what a radiology report would be. And he does the same for rib fractures and CT brain and other things in this case. His next section after the imaging findings is his general comments. And in this section, he summarizes information and knowledge that he is relying upon to generate his opinion, which is coming in the next section. So this is quite technical information with references, but again, it's written for the layperson. So in Jeremy's example, in his general comment section, he has headings like fracture healing, dating of fractures, information about rib fractures, humeral fractures, and specifically humeral fractures from rolling when babies roll over. And so this contains a lot of detailed information, resources, but again, illustrations and language that communicates it to a layperson. And again, so this is information that he can use over and over again from case to case. Most important section is his specific opinions. So this is where Jeremy offers his expert opinions on the case. In his example, he talks about the dating and the mechanism for each of the injuries. So the humeral fracture, he goes through dating and mechanism. For the rib fractures, he goes through dating and mechanism. And then importantly, he provides a summary of all the findings together and how they relate to each other, because one injury and a second injury, they're a pattern. They should be taken together. And so presumably in malpractice cases, a lot of the opinion section like this would be about whether you expect a professional of sufficient training to correctly detect and communicate the imaging finding that was presumably missed or misinterpreted. So that's the specific opinion section. And then he finishes off just with the declaration. And then he includes quite nicely a glossary of terms so that each of the kind of terms that are used in there can also be defined, and then some references. So that's the structure that he uses.
Before we jump back in, what do you think about the idea that we should be taking some lessons from this approach for general radiology reports, particularly now that we have the ability to link to online resources or definitions, etc.? Should we be trying to build reports that the GP or even the patient can understand the background of, rather than relying on your own domain-specific knowledge and difficult terminology?
I think so. I think particularly with AI being able to assist in generating that. So if you're still generating your standard, technical report, and then AI perhaps is assisting to create a detechnicalized version that's auto-generated that then you can approve as a supplementary part of your report that's targeted at the layperson. Maybe it contains images with labels and things like that. I think that would be
Or
a good
links to
addition.
Radiopedia. Any of you budding reporting workstation software companies out there.
Yeah, reach out. We've told people not to reach out to us
That's
with
right.
commercial ideas on the podcast. All right, well, let's get back into it and listen to the second half of Jeremy's lecture here, and then we'll be back for a chat in the outro.
So that's how I put together a report. I've found that works best for me. It helps me when I'm in court. The barristers have used my report and the order in which I've set out the report to take me through my evidence, and they've repeatedly said that it's been very helpful for them. And I've also prepared this and presented it to our chief police officers locally, and they found it helpful as well. Once the report is finished and you've proofread it, maybe more than once, you'll send it to the police or solicitor. It may be that you don't hear any more about the case. You might get some feedback about the outcome. Sometimes, though, you'll be asked to attend court and give evidence in a trial. We're going to talk about that now, and I'm going to give you some pro tips along the way. First, we're going to touch on the level of evidence required. Then we're going to chat about what happens up until the start of giving evidence. And finally, we're going to talk about evidence. Knowing what level of evidence is required is really helpful. If you're appearing in a lower court, then the level of evidence required will most likely be based on the balance of probability. That's also called the 51% rule. Consider a seesaw. If you put the evidence for on one side and the evidence against on the other, which way would the seesaw tip? If on the balance of probability your opinion is that X caused Y, then say so. In the High Court, the level of evidence required is different. Here, the prosecution needs to prove something beyond reasonable doubt. In that seesaw analogy, if one end of the seesaw just comes off the ground, that's enough for the accused to be found not guilty. Where I work, a citation for a court appearance is usually hand-delivered by a police officer. The information in the citation will state the details of the case, which usually includes the defendant's name, but may not include the name of the patient who you wrote the report for. If you've written several reports, it can take a little while and a little bit of detective work to find out the correct case. In most court systems, the citation will be for the start date of the court case, and that case may have been listed to appear in court for several days. It's worth contacting whoever asks you for your report to find out whether the court can confirm a specific date and time that you can give your evidence. In the days before your court appearance, it's worthwhile reading your report again and making some notes. You'll not be able to take those notes into court with you, but it's useful nonetheless to do a bit of review. I'd also suggest rereading any relevant reports and looking at the imaging again. Ask yourself a question. Do you still agree with everything that you wrote in your report? If you don't, it's absolutely fine, but you need to let the instructing solicitor know before court. Changing your opinion is allowed. Concealing a change of opinion is not, especially under oath. If you've never been to court before, or you haven't been to the court that's called you, it's worthwhile taking a look at where it is and how you're going to get there. If new things heighten your stress levels, it might be worth going for a pre-visit. Knowing the layout of the court building might help reduce the stress levels a little bit. Double check that you've got some appropriate clothes to wear. If you usually wear scrubs at work, do those smart clothes still fit? In these post-COVID times, there's a chance you might need a trip to the shops. On the day of court, arrive in plenty time, but be prepared to wait. I'd suggest taking a pair of headphones and a book. Don't take anything of particular value. The court may not have the ability to safely hold your bag. When the court's ready for you, a court officer will come and ask you into court. In most courts, this will be through a side door. While courts may differ in their layout, my experience is that the witness will be to the left of the judge and the jury to their right. That means that as a witness, you need to look right to look at the judge and look straight ahead to see the jury. The barristers and the solicitors will be opposite the judge, to your left, and the defendant will usually be behind them. Once you've been led to the witness stand, the judge will usually direct a clerk to swear you in. You will have almost certainly been asked whether you wish to swear an oath or affirm before the case starts. Swearing an oath means that you swear by God that you will tell the truth. Affirming is a promise to do the same without invoking the name of a supreme being. So, we've prepared the case, we've got ourselves dressed appropriately, been led into court, and have been sworn in. Now what? The judge will direct the prosecution to make their case. This means that they will lead you through your evidence. My experience is that if you've written a good report, they'll just use the order in your report to take them through the evidence. They might ask you to read sections of your report. They might ask you to explain bits of it to the judge and jury. If they do ask you to explain something, look over to the jury, or the judge if there is no jury, and speak to them as if you would to a patient. I found that pretending I wasn't in court and that I was speaking to a junior medical student was helpful. If some of the jurors look a little bit confused, just explain it in a slightly different way. Try and use non-medical terms or explain them if you have to use them. After the prosecution is finished, the judge will ask the defense to cross-examine you. This is the bit that everyone is most nervous about. What are they going to ask me? What if I don't know the answer to their question? What if they get me to say something I didn't mean to say? Being cross-examined is difficult and stressful. I'm not going to say otherwise, but I do have some pro tips which I've learned or been told over the years. The defence barrister has a couple of tricks that they can use to reduce the validity of your evidence if it doesn't meet their narrative. They may try to question whether you have the experience to be an expert. That's one of the reasons why the first section of my report describes what I've done and gives some evidence that I've the experience to be an expert and that I've written previous reports and attended court. That can be difficult when you've not been to court much, but can be countered by describing clinical experience, published work, or your experience report writing. They may agree with some of your statements. Of course there's been an injury, but then counter with a specific such as timing. It couldn't have been my client because they weren't there at a particular time. Or severity. Is it not possible this injury could have happened by another means? These counterclaims will almost certainly make you feel awkward because they're usually possible, but not likely. For example, the case of a baby with multiple rib fractures found at 2 weeks of life. The barrister asked whether it was possible if the rib fractures could occur secondary to birth. In this sort of situation, I'm happy to explain that while there might have been reports of rib fractures following childbirth, they're extremely rare, present with symptoms in the neonatal period, are usually associated with clavicle fractures, and are the result of a difficult delivery. And that in this case, there was no history of a difficult delivery, no clavicle fracture, no concern in the postnatal period by the medical staff about the condition of the baby prior to discharge. It's unusual that an experienced barrister would approach that question in that way. They would much prefer to control the narrative, and so they'll ask short questions that naturally have a yes or no answer. Each question will build on each other, and on their own they may feel appropriate, but taken together they have cleverly weakened an area of your evidence. This is where a good barrister makes their money. How do you deal with that? Well, keep an eye out for the short, sharp questions that seem to have a yes-no answer. Agree with them if they're correct, but if there's nuance or complexity that's being overlooked, say so. As you get more experienced, these start to be easier to spot, and you can usually work out where the defense is going early on. There will be a question with an expected yes-no answer, but the question oversimplifies a topic or ignores context. So what do? Explain that there isn't a simple yes-no answer and that the question is complex or isn't relevant because of a particular reason. The barrister will either ignore the question and move on, or they'll have to ask you why it's complex, and then you can explain. As this back and forth ensues, don't get sucked into an argument. They are trained in arguing, and they're doing it on their turf. Instead, do what you're there to do. Give evidence to the jury. If you feel that you're being drawn into an argument, stop. When the barrister is asking you a question, be polite and look at them. But once they're finished, turn back and look at the jury and give them the answer. Then, once you're finished, look back at the barrister. This means that they know when you're finished, and it makes it much more difficult for them to interrupt you. One of the first cases where I appeared in High Court, I find myself in exactly this position. The barrister had hooked me and was slowly reeling me in. The week before, I'd heard exactly this advice from an excellent colleague who does expert work. And midway through the back and forth interaction with the barrister, I remembered his advice. From that point on, I looked at the barrister when they asked questions and then answered them to the jury. And when the jury didn't look like they understood, I went into teaching mode and explained things to them. The difference between the start and the end of my interaction with the barrister was massive. Another thing that they love to do is to ask a question once and then ask it again in a slightly different way, and then again and again. They're waiting for you to change your answer. Don't be drawn in. After being asked a couple of times, I will say that the question is the same as the last question, and my answer hasn't changed. After a couple of trips to court, I found myself in the situation where the defence barrister was asking the same question over and over and over again. I plucked up the courage to turn to the judge and said that I'd answered the question 5 times already and I wasn't going to change my answer if I was asked the same question again. I kept looking at her. She looked over to the defence barrister and asked him to move on. If you do that sort of thing in a balanced and kind way, I think it's fine. It's going to irritate the barrister though, so be careful. Why do they do it? Why do they ask these repeated questions? Well, they want you to change what you say or to test whether you really know your topic. They might also want to determine whether there's a slightly off-topic subject that they can talk about. If a barrister can get you into an area that you don't know about, they will. And then they'll keep probing until you say something you didn't really mean to say or can't substantiate. So, head it off at the pass. If the topic falls outside your area of expertise, say so. If you're an expert in radiology and you don't have the experience about looking after patients, say so. Explain to the court that your work is to look at an X-ray or a CT scan, and that your clinical interaction is with the teams who look after the patients and not with the patients themselves. As such, you can't comment about what symptoms the patient would display with a particular injury. Other experts can be asked those questions. One of the final things that I've experienced quite a lot is where the barrister will focus on one injury and give all sorts of potential reasons for it. And then they'll move to the next injury and try and explain that one away. If the case has multiple linked findings, I think it's entirely reasonable to point out that they are linked and that the job of a radiologist is to make assertions based on all of the evidence, not individual parts. At the end of the day, the most important thing to remember is that it's not just your evidence that the court is hearing. Answer the questions honestly, because once the cross-examination is over, the judge will ask the prosecution if there's any re-examination. This is where they can ask some additional questions to clarify anything that you've said in cross-examination. It's the barrister's job to put forward evidence to fit their narrative and to try and prove that the defendant is either guilty or not guilty. It's your job to give evidence so that the court can make the best decision possible. Sometimes this may mean that you need to challenge the question that's being asked, but it always means answering the question honestly and fully. Well, that's us. We've chatted about what an expert witness is and why you might consider being one. We've talked about report writing, and I've shown you how I go about it. And we've talked about going to court and giving evidence. I hope that you've enjoyed our time together and that you've learned something new. See you soon.
Thank you very much to Jeremy Jones there for that presentation. I just love how calm and measured Jones is. Absolute legend, that guy. What did you think, Frank? Have you done any expert work other than turning up for this podcast in the past?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is that I doubt very much that I could do Jeremy's job, particularly in that topic. I found even just our rotations through the Children's Hospital quite confronting. I'm very glad someone like Jeremy does it, but it wouldn't be for me. But I absolutely agree that being available for expert witness or reports is part of our job, particularly if you work in a academic or teaching center. That is sort of our responsibility. And I have done a modest amount of expert work, but never ended up in court for that. Well, actually, before we get to Jeremy's talk, I do have one medico-legal experience to recount that dates
Okay.
back many years. In fact, before I was a radiologist, I was a second-year trainee in a rural hospital. We had to rotate out. I think it's Wangaratta, smallish town, maybe 4 hours north of Melbourne. Anyway, I got a call from the police saying that they were looking into a manslaughter case which predated to when I was doing neurosurgery. And it was a tragic story. It was a father and son who got into an argument, and the son pushed his dad in the chest, and the father tripped over backwards and hit his head on the concrete or something, and he was on warfarin and he died. And so not only did he kill his father, sounded accidentally, but now he was up for manslaughter. Anyway, they said, "Oh, we'd like to interview you about your recollections of what happened." So it was years before, so I got the hospital to send me the reports, and then it was video conference because I was in the country. And so I remember I'd been doing a barium list, and I was in scrubs, and at the time I had long hair and I hadn't shaved, and I had a burrito that I was eating for lunch, and I'm sitting in this room with all my notes in front of me, sort of chewing, waiting for the teleconference to start. And it was one of those cameras that swivels.
Oh, yeah.
And then I see it turns on, the little red light starts, and it swivels towards me, and I'm halfway through a mouthful, and the TV goes on, and I'm in court, and no one had told me. And there was a jury and a judge. I think I had bits of, probably feces stained barium on my top and burrito hanging out of my mouth. But the thing that really struck me was this was a really important case. Someone could end up going to jail for significant amounts of time. And the sort of questions they were asking me about the notes that I'd written as a resident, and it was the first time I turned up, was like, how do you get this far knowing so little? And it was like, oh, here you've written HA. What does that mean? It's like, oh, that's headache. And it also made me realize just how important keeping notes that aren't just in acronyms is. Anyway, that's my one time I went to court. But all
and you
the
didn't even know it.
No, that's right. And all the times I did medico-legal reports, I fortunately, I guess, did not end up in court, because I'm sure it's pretty stressful from the way Jeremy describes it anyway.
I reckon I'd be absolutely terrible in court. I'd be trying to get, are we trying to get like a smile or a laugh out of people, which is not, it's not the place for it, right? But it's kind of like, that's
wacka, wacka, wacka.
It would not work. Whereas Jeremy would be absolutely perfect. I can see him sitting there and doing the job and being pleasant and smiling, but absolutely not putting a foot wrong. This is unrelated really, but I have the only thing I could think of when I thought of interactions with legal people was I recently remembered that we have pigeonholes at work where like letters and documents get put. And I hadn't looked at it for years and years. I reckon pre-COVID, right, was the last time I looked at this thing, because I just forgot it existed. I just assumed everything was via email, right? So a few weeks ago, I was like, oh, we've got pigeonholes. I should look and see what's in there. Anyway, it was packed full of stuff, right? All of it was junk. But there was one letter from 4 or 5 years ago from some legal practice wanting some legal documents or something sent to them. And I remember it said something like $50 will be provided for your photocopying services or something like that.
And you just ghosted them.
Anyway, presumably they moved on and did the case without me. But anyway, that just reminded me. Pigeonholes. So one aspect of Jones's lecture there that I really enjoyed was a lot of that kind of practical advice that he included in there.
Absolutely.
Familiarizing yourself with the location of the courtroom, the layout of the courtroom, reading your notes or your report the evening before.
Those sort of advices made me think of just how you should prepare for an exam as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's a high stress environment, and the last thing you need on top of everything is to not be sure where something is, turning up late, not knowing your surroundings.
Yeah, but even like going down to the level of, don't bring an expensive device because you might not be able to store it safely, but
Mm,
bring a book, some headphones to listen to some music or something. And then also that advice when you're actually in the courtroom of addressing the jury members or the judge rather than the defendant's lawyer, even though they're the one who've asked the question, you are
yeah.
answering to the jury. And then once you see their faces, you understand whether they're coming along and understanding what you're saying and whether you need to detechnicalize further. I thought that was a really good tip.
Which again is like when you're giving a talk, being able to see the audience
Yeah.
and you get that immediate feedback as to whether you're making sense, whether they're confused, whether you're going too
Mm.
quickly or slowly. Yeah,
Yeah, which
absolutely.
is one of the challenges of recording an online lecture, right? Without being able to
Yeah.
see the faces. It's almost as if you need to have practice in front of a room where you can see the faces, and therefore you've got that feedback of what parts you need to go into more detail, where you need to slow down, so that when you record your online lecture, you can kind of simulate that and you know which bits you need to do that for. But it is, yeah, it's really important. I know you often when you're giving lectures, you'll seek out that one person in the room who's like giving you
Yeah,
the nods
absolutely.
and smiling at you, as
Yeah.
opposed to that person who's falling asleep, or
Oh, you
those
have to
99% of people who are falling asleep.
ignore the ones that are looking bored,
Yeah,
because if you start focusing on them, you get this deflation and your energy levels go really
yeah,
down and you start doubting yourself. Whereas you find the ones that are really into it and it's like, awesome, it's just the two of us, baby.
yeah. It would be the same with jurors, right? If you've got a
Yeah.
juror who's like, coming along and understanding and nodding, that's the person who you naturally start addressing your speech to. The other thing I'd never ever thought of was that it's okay to change your mind between your report and what you're going to present in court, but you must let the instructing solicitor know in advance. I had no idea about that kind of
Mm.
thing.
No surprises, I think, is the rule here.
Yeah, yeah.
Unlike a Perry Mason whodunit movie.
Yeah. Well, it does seem like there's massive plot twists in a lot of movies and courtroom dramas where you completely surprise even your own solicitor. But apparently, no, that's not
I'm
allowed
just
to happen.
picturing you in a courtroom screaming, "You can't handle the truth."
What about your experience with writing reports then, Gayla? What's that been like?
So I've done a bunch predominantly for coroner's cases and all in neuro. And I found it really interesting. One, because I think when things go wrong, there's often a lot of lessons that you can take out of it for your own
Mm,
practice. And you end up reading and thinking about a topic in a very different way when you see how it all unravels. And in almost all the cases, what really struck me is how our reports, and this ties back to what we were talking about before, are so technical and so reliant on a medical audience
mm,
to understand it that even highly educated, intelligent, non-medical people really do need a translator. And a large part of that sort of role is, as Jeremy points out, to provide that context and link between the day-to-day technical reports that we issue and how they relate to sort of reality, and not assuming that people can understand what a fracture is, or
mm,
the anatomy of the base of skull, or what a pituitary adenoma is, etc. All of those you kind of need to define. And it has sort of changed how I report to a degree, not in a more defensive way, but more clarity and being
mhm.
more specific about the words that I use. I think often, particularly in conclusions,
Yeah,
we use ambiguous terminology. And when it comes to be read out in court, I don't think there's a thing that I say to convince registrars to not use terms in their reports that imply the act of perception.
yeah,
No lung cancer is seen.
mhm.
And it's like you missed it and you go to court and you're about to be sentenced to something for having missed a cancer. And then you go, but Your Honor, I didn't say there was no cancer. I just said I didn't
I
see
didn't
it.
see it. Yeah.
And it's like, oh, yeah, you're fine. Don't worry about it then. And it's like none of that helps, but it actually makes you sound worse.
Mm.
And so being more precise.
My conclusions are kind of written like it was the best of basal ganglia hemorrhages. It was the worst of.
Yeah,
One thing I wanted to mention here, because we've got Jones on and he was talking about non-accidental injury, it reminded me probably 5 or 6 years ago, we taught this course in Melbourne, Gaylord. You were there as well.
Oh, I do remember this.
We had Jeremy and Vikas Shah come across from the UK, and Jeremy gave the final lecture of the day, and it was about non-accidental injury. And it was extremely poignant, right? You could hear a pin drop in the room
There were literally a few people crying in the audience.
Because what he did was he showed a case and then he showed another case, and you thought they were unrelated, but what it was siblings.
That's right.
And it showed the importance of not missing that first one because you could have prevented that second one, and that really brought it home. And the room was very emotional. And then because I'd organised this day and I planned to finish off with this kind of finale quiz at the end of the day, I had it all set up and I was ready to go. And the quiz was, absolute silliness. And I remember I had a picture of Jeremy and Vikas that went up on the screen with like Union Jack hats on their heads, and I'd coloured out their teeth so they had little gaps, terrible British looking teeth. So I get up there after everyone's really emotional. Would have been a perfect end to the day after Jeremy did that, and I do this silly little quiz. It was I looked like an absolute clown.
No
show
doubt,
must go on.
not a unique experience, Dixon.
All right, well, I think we better wrap this episode up. Gaylord, how can people get in contact with us?
Well, we're at Radiopedia on X and Instagram, as well as at Frank Gaylord and at Dr. Andrew Dixon. And you can probably even better email us at podcast@radiopedia.org with ideas and feedback. Email is for old people, but that's us now. We're growing into it.
Very much so. And I should remind people that voting is still open for the Stay Rad song contest from a few episodes back. And Gaylord, I've looked at the votes and it's very, very close.
Are we going to end up with death metal, like with Bodie McBoatface, when we let the internet vote on something?
We've had 100 of votes, not hundreds, 100 of votes. For a bit of extra fun, I've decided that we're going to give one random lucky voter free registration for Radiopedia 2024 as an incentive to get your votes in. So maybe go back to that episode, find the link. We'll put it in the show notes for this episode as well, the link to the voting form, vote for one of the songs, and maybe go in the running for a conference registration.
That sounds good. And don't forget that if you want to help support Radiopedia, then in addition to voting for songs, you can become a paid supporter via the website or purchase an all-access pass to our online courses and conference. And that doing so, well, you help us to give everything away for free for all 125 low and middle income countries. And that includes registration to the conference.
And what else can people do to help us out, Frank?
And you can also help out by leaving us a 5-star review in the podcast app of your choosing.
Absolutely, that's correct. So we'll be back. We have ourselves a little challenge for next episode to satisfy one of our listeners who we ignored for many, many months. So that is number one priority for Frank. He has no idea what it is. But we'll find out, and we'll catch you all again sometime soon in the reading room.
Stay rad, everyone. Stay rad.
We need one of those dung-dungs at the end.
Murph can add it in.
Yep. Yeah, add it in. Dung-dung. The cases are real. The people are real. See ya, Frank. See you in a couple of weeks.
See ya. Bye-bye.
He's walking down his corridor. He's sighing. He's got a glass of water. He's opening it. It's got some bubbles in it. Hopefully. Oh, hear that? That's him pouring the water out. He's taking a seat. He's groaning like a 50-year-old man.
All right. Sorry about that.
Now he's got his headphones on. I can stop offending him now. Just thought I'd do a running commentary while we waited for you.
Excellent. Good.
Can I start the episode now, Frank?
I'm sure you were kind.
Welcome once again into the Radiopedia Reading Room, a podcast